Just the moment he said estate planning at a backyard barbecue, and I knew something was very wrong. We'd only known my daughter's boyfriend for 4 months. 4 months! And there he was, standing next to the grill, holding a bottle of Sam Adams he hadn't touched, asking me what I intended to do with the house after I passed on. He said it just like that, casual, like he was asking about the weather. I smiled and changed the subject. But I didn't forget. My name is Pauline, and I am 67 years old. I taught third grade for 31 years at the same elementary school in Bozeman, Montana. I retired with a pension, a 403B, that my late husband Harold and I had carefully built over decades, and this house, a four-bedroom colonial on just under 2 acres that we bought in 1989 for $112,000, and that is now worth considerably more. Harold passed 8 years ago from a heart attack, sudden, no warning. One morning he was making coffee and then he was gone. After that, it was just me. And my daughter, Claire. Claire was 34 when she met him. She'd been focused on her nursing career through her 20s, not much interested in dating, and I never pushed. She was happy. She had friends, she had her work, she had Sunday dinners with me every week without fail. Then she met him at a hospital fundraiser. He was there representing some real estate consulting firm, and within 6 weeks she was talking about him constantly. His name was Derek. Derek was 41, never married, no children. He was tall and well-dressed and said all the right things. He called me Miss Pauline the first time we met, which I thought was charming. He opened doors. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk. He asked about Harold, listened to my stories, nodded at the right moments. He was the kind of man who seems almost too attentive, like he's memorizing you rather than listening to you. But I'm a retired third-grade teacher. I spent 31 years reading rooms full of 8-year-olds who were trying to get away with something. I know when a smile doesn't reach someone's eyes. The first time he asked about the house, I let it go. Curiosity, I thought. People ask about property values in Montana. It's common conversation. But then it happened again at Claire's birthday dinner. He asked how the property taxes were, whether I'd ever thought about downsizing, whether I had a financial advisor. I answered vaguely and excused myself to bring out the cake. The third time was worse. We were sitting on my back porch in late October, watching the last of the leaves come down off the big cottonwood Harold planted the year Claire was born. Derek asked me, very gently, whether I had a will in place, whether Claire was listed as my beneficiary on my retirement accounts, whether I'd considered a living trust. I set down my mug and looked at him. "Derek," I said, "why do you ask?" He smiled. That wide, practiced smile. "I just care about Claire's future, Miss Pauline, and yours. I've seen families torn apart by poor estate planning. I'd hate for that to happen to you." I said that was very thoughtful of him. Inside, I called my attorney the next morning. His name is Howard. He's been my family lawyer for 20 years, handled Harold's estate, and is not easily rattled. I told him about the questions. Howard was quiet for a moment and then said, "Pauline, don't change a single document. Don't sign anything. And let me do some checking." What Howard found took 2 weeks and made my stomach drop. Derek had been previously engaged. Twice. The first woman was a widow in her late 50s in Billings. The engagement ended after she discovered he'd convinced her to add him to a joint checking account for household expenses. He'd withdrawn $34,000 before she caught it. She hadn't pressed charges. The second woman was in her late 60s, a retired pharmacist in Great Falls. That engagement also ended abruptly. Her adult son had intervened. No criminal record. Nothing provable. Just a pattern. I sat with that information for 3 days before I told anyone. I cried once, in the kitchen, at night, thinking about Claire. She was so happy. She talked about him the way she used to talk about getting the role of Dorothy in her 6th grade play, with this pure, uncomplicated joy. The idea of taking that from her made me feel like the worst person alive. But the alternative was worse. I didn't confront Derek. I didn't confront Claire. Instead, I did something that took everything I had. I kept showing up to Sunday dinners with him there. I kept being polite. I kept asking about his work, passing him the breadbasket, laughing at his jokes. Every single week, while Howard was quietly gathering more documentation and I was keeping copies of everything in a fireproof lockbox at Howard's office. In February, Claire called me on a Tuesday night, which was unusual. Her voice was bright and a little breathless. "Mom," she said, "he proposed." I told her I was happy for her. My voice didn't shake. I don't know how. The engagement changed things. Derek became more comfortable, more present. He started coming to the house without Claire sometimes, just to check in on me, he said. Once he asked if he could use my home office to take a work call. I said, of course, and then I sat in the kitchen and listened. I couldn't make out words, but the call lasted 40 minutes, which seemed long for a routine business matter. The week after that, he asked me, for the first time directly, whether I'd be willing to sit down with him and a financial planner he trusted to talk about consolidating my accounts for simplicity. I said I'd think about it. I had Howard call the financial planner's firm the next day. The planner was real. The firm was real. But Derek had referred 3 other clients to that firm in the past 2 years, all of them older women, all of them recently widowed or divorced. 2 of those women had moved significant assets into vehicles that gave their partners oversight rights. I don't know what happened to them after that. Howard said he didn't want to know either. In March, something shifted in Claire. She called me more. Stopped by twice without Derek. The second time, she sat at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and didn't say much. She asked me if I was happy. I asked her the same. She said yes, but she looked like someone trying to convince herself. Then, in early April, she showed up on a Wednesday morning. She'd called in sick to work. That had never happened in 11 years of nursing. She came inside, sat down, and for a long time she just looked at the cottonwood tree out the window. Finally, she said, "Mom, there are things he said. About money. About your house. About after you're gone." I reached across the table and took her hand. She told me everything. She told me everything. The comments he'd made that she'd tried to dismiss. The time he'd casually mentioned that, once we're married, my estate would simplify down to her, and therefore to him as her husband. The time he'd asked her what she knew about contesting a will. The time he'd told her, smiling, that older women were often easily influenced, and that it was just reality. She was shaking by the end. "I didn't want to see it," she said. "I kept thinking I was imagining it." "You weren't imagining it," I said. I got up and made us both fresh tea, and then I sat back down and I told her everything I knew. About Billings, about Great Falls, about the financial planner and the pattern, about Howard, about the lockbox. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "What do we do?" We had a plan within a week. Howard helped us build it. We were not going to simply break off the engagement and hope that was the end of it. Because based on the pattern, Derek didn't tend to let things go quietly. He would need to understand, clearly and with documentation, that we had everything, and that if he pursued any claim or caused any trouble, the information we had would go to the Montana Department of Justice, to the 2 previous women he'd targeted, and to every person in his professional network. But there was one more thing we needed. Proof. Something current. Something that showed his intent clearly, not just a pattern of behavior from his past. Claire got it for us. She invited him to dinner at her apartment in mid-April and asked him directly, in a conversation she recorded on her phone with Howard's guidance on what was legally permissible in Montana, which allows single-party consent, whether he had ever looked into what her inheritance from me might look like. She was warm, she was casual, she said she'd been thinking about their financial future. He told her. In detail. He knew the approximate value of the house. He knew I had retirement accounts. He mentioned, and this is the part that still makes me cold, that he'd done research into how a spouse could request an accounting of a parent-in-law's assets in certain legal circumstances. He talked for 11 minutes. Claire sat there and nodded and kept her hands still in her lap. She called me from her car in the parking lot afterward, voice completely flat, and said, "I have it, Mom." I could hear her hands shaking against the phone. We set the date for 2 weeks later. We chose a Sunday dinner, the setting Derek knew best, where he was most comfortable, where he felt he'd already won. Howard was there, sitting in Harold's old armchair in the living room when Derek walked in. Claire was beside me in the kitchen doorway. Derek saw Howard and his smile flickered, just for a moment. "Derek," I said, "please sit down." What followed was not dramatic, not loud, not the kind of scene you see in movies. Howard laid out the documentation. The two previous women, the financial planner referrals, the recording, the specific statements Derek had made about my estate, my retirement accounts, my house. Howard explained in the calm and precise language of a man who has practiced law for 35 years exactly what would happen if Derek chose to complicate the end of this engagement in any way. Derek sat very still through all of it. His jaw tightened once near the end. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and said, "I think we all know this relationship is over." He walked to the door. He picked up his coat from the hook Harold had put there in 1994, and he left. We heard his car pull out of the driveway. Then it was quiet. Claire sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, which is not something she has done since she was about 9 years old. I sat down next to her. Howard came and stood in the doorway, looking at us both, and said, "I'll see myself out," very quietly, and I heard the front door close. We sat there on the kitchen floor for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a robin was doing something in the cottonwood tree. At some point, Claire put her head on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said. "I almost let him—" "You didn't," I said. "You didn't." She called me this morning. She's been seeing a therapist, which I'm glad about. She sounded like herself again, a little slower, a little more careful, but herself. She told me she'd gone for a long hike over the weekend, one of the trails Harold used to take her on when she was little. I told her I'd been working in the garden, planting sweet peas along the back fence, which is something I do every spring because Harold loved them and because they smell like a good memory. She said, "I love you, Mum." I said, "I know, I love you too." There are things I've thought about since this ended. I've thought about the women in Billings and Great Falls, and whether anyone ever sat down with them the way I sat down with Claire. I've thought about how easy it might have been to explain away Derek's questions one by one, to give the benefit of the doubt, to want the story to be simpler than it was. I almost did that. There were nights I almost talked myself out of calling Howard, out of asking questions, out of trusting the feeling in my chest that said something is wrong here. What I want to say, to anyone who is watching this and recognizes something, a question that came a little too soon, a smile that looked a little too practiced, a conversation about your house or your accounts or your will that felt a little off, is this: trust that feeling. You're not being paranoid. You're not being unkind. You're not causing problems. You are paying attention. And paying attention is the thing that matters most. If I had anything to do over again, I would have called Howard sooner. I would have trusted myself faster. And I would have sat down on the kitchen floor with my daughter and said what needed to be said about 3 months earlier than I did. But she is okay. We are okay. The sweet peas are coming up along the back fence, and the cottonwood Harold planted is leafing out for the 34th spring. And on Sunday, my daughter is coming for dinner, and she is bringing a pie she made herself because she wanted to, not because anyone asked her to. That is enough. That is everything. I keep thinking about the cottonwood tree, the one Harold planted the year Claire was born. It doesn't know anything about Derek, about the recording, about the documents in Howard's fireproof lockbox. It just keeps growing. Every spring it leafs out exactly the same, unbothered, because that's what it was built to do. I think about that a lot now. What happened to us, to Claire and me, didn't happen because we were lucky. It happened because, somewhere along the way, I had learned to trust the thing in my chest that said something is wrong here, even when every polite instinct told me to explain it away. That's not intuition as magic. That's just what happens when you've spent enough years paying attention to people. 31 years of third graders will do that to you. You learn that the ones who are trying to get away with something always give it away eventually, not in the big moments, but in the small ones. The way they pause before answering. The way the smile comes just a half second too late. Derek was never going to be caught by one mistake. He was too careful for that. What caught him was accumulation. Every question about the house, every mention of estate planning at a barbecue, every reference to what happens after you're gone, none of those things, alone, would have meant anything. Together they meant everything. That's how it works. The truth assembles itself piece by piece if you're willing to keep watching. I've thought about what I might have done differently. I could have confronted him sooner and lost the evidence. I could have said nothing and lost my daughter to a man who was counting her inheritance before we'd had a full year of Sunday dinners together. Instead, I called Howard. I made copies. I sat across from Derek at my own table every single week and passed him the bread and smiled, while the case against him was quietly being built in a lawyer's office across town. That took something out of me that I haven't fully named yet, but it was the right thing, and I knew it was the right thing, and I did it anyway. That is the part I want Claire to carry forward, not the fear of what almost happened, the knowledge that she saw it clearly when it mattered, that she sat in her car in that parking lot with shaking hands and called me and said, "I have it, Mum." She could have kept explaining away the comments. She could have chosen the easier story. She didn't. That took a kind of courage that has nothing to do with being fearless. It's the courage that shows up when you are absolutely afraid and you do the right thing regardless. And Howard, quiet, steady Howard, who has seen the worst of what people do to each other over money and property and grief, and who still picks up the phone on the first ring when something matters. There is a kind of integrity in that I don't take for granted. I am 67 years old. I have outlived my husband, outlived a career, outlived the version of myself that might have been too polite to make that first call. What I have left is this house, this tree, my daughter, and the understanding that the people who try to take things from others are almost always counting on you being too kind, too uncertain, or too tired to look closely. I looked closely. And on Sunday, Claire is bringing pie.